Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unauthorized Disclosure. I am Rania Kalik, one of your hosts, and I'm joined by the show's other host, Kevin Gastola. Hello, Kevin.
Hey there.
And we have with us today a friend of the show who's back for like the third or fourth time. Max Blumenthal, author and journalist, founder of the Grayzone. Thank you for coming back on, Max.
Thanks. And you all have one of the longest running podcasts I know of, so I'm offended that this is only the third or fourth time.
I think it's actually probably like the fifth or sixth, but
Okay.
it's been
Friend of the show territory.
7 years.
That's
impressive.
crazy.
That's before, podcasting was like what blogging was in the 2000s.
That's a good point. 7 years. So, okay, to get into it, you recently got back from a trip to, I know everybody wants to talk about the US elections, or maybe they're exhausted from them, like I am, watching two turtles race to the top at how slow it's been. But you were recently covering a very different election in Bolivia. You were there, I think, like last week you got back. And that was the big story before the US elections, was this election in Bolivia after last year's right-wing US-backed coup that ousted democratically elected President Evo Morales. So you and the Grayzone team were on the ground. I think it's going to be pretty refreshing talking about a topic that's different than what's happening in the US, but maybe you could start by giving us an idea of how the Bolivian elections were different. You were an observer, so they were different. How are they different from the shit show that we've watched take place in the US this week?
Well, I think we need to talk about the US election now too. And I was also in Miami on my way back. I stopped there for a few days just to see what was going on. And we published a piece by a friend of mine in Miami who's a student at Florida International, who really lives in the heart of the beast of the Latin American diaspora, the right-wing diaspora in Miami. And it totally foreshadowed what was going to happen in Miami. And you could just feel it on the ground in Miami, that Trump was going to absolutely clobber Biden in that area. And it relates back to Bolivia. But there are so many other factors. I mean, COVID was a huge factor in the Bolivian election. It was used by what we know of as the coup administration of Janine Áñez to delay the election twice, because they just wanted to keep holding on to power, even though they weren't there as a provisional interim government to do anything except call new elections. And here, COVID obviously had a huge impact on the election. I mean, I think it's true that it harmed Trump in some respects. I mean, it basically took the economy into a state of spiraling oblivion, with the Fed endlessly printing money and people on the verge of being evicted all over the country. And, Trump had previously been boasting about the greatest economy in U.S. history and was planning to run his reelection campaign on the economy. But I think COVID also helped Trump in some ways that a lot of people don't understand. I saw an exit poll that showed 48% of voters thought Trump's response, or the government's response, was positive. And you could write that off as conspiratorial QAnon right-wingers who are immersed in a world of, Breitbart and One American News. But the fact is, Joe Biden was promising a lockdown, and at least many voters read it that way. He was promising to force them to stay at home with their kids. The kids wouldn't be socialized. He was promising mask mandates. I believe mask mandates were on the ballot in certain places. COVID kind of became a wedge issue. And a lot of people, including in places where I was, I've also, been out in Trump country in Michigan earlier this year. And, when you get a sense of the atmosphere out there, people just don't want to be locked down. COVID is already out there. People are sort of coping with it. And I actually sympathize with working people who don't want to be locked down, who aren't like on some like MacArthur Genius Grant fellowship where they can just stay at home and work on learn a new language and work on, some pointless, video about how like we need renewable energy or something. Like they just don't have that luxury. And Trump spoke to that. I think Trump did a lot of things that below the radar were very politically savvy. He claimed credit for reopening Big Ten football, which is such a big institution in Middle America in the swing states, in Michigan, Wisconsin, places, Illinois, places like that. I mean, Illinois is not a swing state, but he took credit for that. He, courted everyone from Jorge Masvidal, who is a popular MMA fighter, as a Latino proxy, to Lil Pump, who is a popular SoundCloud rapper who he announced as Little Pimp at his final rally, and got mocked for it. But these are the kind of like micro trends that drive voters. And, Trump being close to a culture like MMA shows a much more organic connection to a real grassroots constituency and growing popular subculture than Biden being in his basement. Also, Biden being in his basement during COVID, while Trump actually got COVID, demonstrated to a lot of people that Trump was more of a worker and a fighter in their minds. I'm not speaking for myself. So while Trump was mocked for getting COVID, I mean, we have now this culture of mocking people for getting coronavirus as if, they're responsible. He kind of took it proudly. He wanted to like rip open his shirt and have a Superman shirt under it. I thought that would have been, for his base and a lot of people who don't typically vote, a brilliant political move. Everyone on Twitter would have, and especially on left Twitter, would have mocked it. But when you get out in the country, you just see it a different way. And also just traveling, so many people just submit to, they say, well, we believe in science, as if the scientists at the NIH and elsewhere aren't compromised by Big Pharma or the Gates Foundation. And they just take their word and are afraid to travel. And, when you travel in this country or traveling to South America and traveling around Bolivia, yeah, people definitely take precautions. Everybody wears a mask. People are much more on board with wearing masks in Bolivia and sanitizing. Like when you go into public transportation in Bolivia, there are public workers there to spray you down. And there are even foot pads in front of every restaurant in Bolivia to clean your feet. They don't have that in the US. People do resist wearing masks here, I notice, on flights. But people are out there traveling, and in a flight, the filtration system is pretty effective at filtering out germs. It's probably a safer place to be than in a lot of other indoor situations, but people are afraid to go there. And, just breaking that barrier of fear and traveling constantly and seeing how the rest of the world continues to function, especially a place like Bolivia, where a huge percentage of the population is living close to the poverty line and can't afford to stay home and be under quarantine, or they'll just simply starve and die. You start to see the whole pandemic in a different way. And you don't see it as this public health catastrophe where lockdowns are imperative. You start to see a need to change our behavior. But I think you get into the mindset of working people, including the frontline workers who, if you go to like some gentrified area in Brooklyn or like the wealthy areas of Manhattan, everyone's like banging their pots and pans for the frontline workers and stuff. Those people aren't hearing the pots and pans. They just want to do their job, and they're not like thinking of themselves as heroes who are risking their lives. So, I mean, it's just, we're now in a state where COVID is normalized. I don't think Biden will actually be able to impose lockdowns at this point. It'll hurt the economy. It'll hurt him politically. And so it was all just a bunch of bluster, and you'll get like Fauci as some little trophy. I don't know why everyone worships him and like defends him as this sacred figure. But also another, factor in Bolivia was something that was very similar to the US, was that they bungled their initial response. I mean, I think COVID has become normalized here because of a failed initial response. And but they didn't bungle just COVID. They bungled everything. The coup administration bungled everything. The economy was just completely mismanaged. Entire factories are shut down. Entire industries went offline. And a lot of people voted for Luis Arce, the Movement Towards Socialism candidate, just because he was the finance minister under Evo Morales at the time of a commodities boom, when a lot of Bolivia's major exports, like beef, for example, were selling really well. And a lot of people got wealthy, including people who hate Evo Morales. And so people outside the MAS base voted for him. And we've seen now that country, I mean, I got out into the rural areas, into the Tropic of Cochabamba, which is like the real heartland of MAS territory. It's where the Coca Growers Union is, where all the, coca farms are. It's where Evo Morales was hidden during the coup. And people there said that, they treated COVID with natural plants and found some like effectiveness from things like eucalyptus and other indigenous medicines, but they didn't have anything else to turn to. And now they're moving toward herd immunity. So no one out there even bothers wearing a mask. They've just kind of been through the worst of it. And I think a lot of what I experienced and saw turned what I initially believed back in March when the sort of semi-lockdown began in the US on its head. And that was really instructive for me, beyond what I learned about Bolivian politics and its election system and the viciousness of the right wing and so on.
I do think that since we're bringing it back to the US elections, it's interesting because you're in a place where there actually is a really strong movement that was, even after a year of this coup, as much of a disaster as it was, even after these massacres that took place, were able to still organize. And they've been organizing and they've been politically active because they have no choice. I mean, it's like they're poor. You mentioned like people don't have money, they're poor, they're farmers in rural areas. They don't have a choice. They have to organize. And I kind of like look at places that have movements like that. And then I look at the US where we don't have anything like that. And I'm just wondering, like, when you go to a place like Bolivia that has a strong leftist ideology in one of its largest parties, like the MAS, like, why don't we have that in the US?
Well, I mean,
That's a really big question. I guess I could narrow it down a little bit. I'm just thinking, like, I guess where I'm going with this is like, I see a lot of sort of delusional talk, that like somehow leftists, like, we have all this power because people are joining the DSA, when actually there is no organized left in the country that has like been able to really like organize workers, or has really organizing any big organizing nationwide structure beyond like online and sort of like academics and middle class people, who live in places like Brooklyn and LA and stuff. So I'm just wondering, why do you think it is that in the US we don't have like a workers kind of movement like you might see in Bolivia?
Yeah, I mean, you answered the question pretty well. I pretty much don't really need to say anything. But what does organizing mean? Like, I'm not an organizer. Whenever someone's like, I'm an organizer in the US, I'm like, all right, I'm slamming the door on you like the Avon lady or some like Jehovah's Witnesses. Like, I don't trust you. Like, that basically means you're like some astroturfed NGO person who like basically shovels people back into the Democratic Party. But like, what does organizing mean in Bolivia? First of all, there was a lot of regret among the social movements that they did not sufficiently mobilize when Evo Morales was driven out of the country by the military. And they basically had to mobilize after the coup had sort of consolidated its power, which is what led to the massacre. We just produced a mini documentary about Insencata in the massive indigenous city of El Alto, around this gas plant where the military just came in and mowed people down who were protesting what had just taken place. But they mobilized too late. They felt like they had rested on their laurels and gotten too comfortable and become demobilized because things had been very good for them under Evo, who they helped bring to power. And so as the coup administration continued to kick the can down the road and delay the elections that they were supposed to call, citing the pandemic as a pretext, the social movements that represent the majority of Bolivians, and it's not just indigenous people, although it is heavily indigenous. The miners' union, for example, is a really important part of the structure behind MAS. They shut the country down. They made the country ungovernable in order to force the government to call elections. And no one is talking about making the United States ungovernable except for the sort of non-co-opted social movement that's completely amorphous and heavily infiltrated by law enforcement, which is just known casually as Antifa, but is not exactly controlled. But like, look, what we're going to see take place after the celebration of Biden just barely squeaking through in an election that was actually a major repudiation of corporate media and all of the technocratic institutions, big tech and others that attempted to remove Trump before the election. They are going to be demobilized because they're all co-opted by big foundations. They are part of the nonprofit industrial complex. They don't even qualify as social movements. I saw Jacobin say, we're going to hold Biden accountable. I mean, they had a decent analysis of what a Biden administration is going to be like. It's just going to basically be a big negotiation between him and Mitch McConnell for like a center-right presidency, the kind of caretaker presidency that will be like the wet dream of all the never Trump Republicans and the Bush Republicans. That, I mean, they had a good analysis of that, but then they're like, the Sunrise Movement will hold Biden accountable. And that's like what are they going to do? They were just basically taken out of obscurity by a bunch of Democrat Party billionaires who funded them through a dark money super PAC and put them one floor below the Sierra Fund here on F Street, which is funded to the tune of something like $60 million by Mike Bloomberg. So they're basically a part of the Sierra Fund, which is the quintessential big green NGO.
Wait, are you telling me that a bunch of 10 and 12 and 14-year-olds are not organizing themselves
Well, those
to
are they use like kids as like little props, but these aren't 14-year-olds who are organizers.
Oh, no,
Like,
no, no.
these are adults. These are like people who are like our age.
No, I'm just talking about like it's like when I think of the Sunrise Movement, I think of like those kids who wasn't that the same group that like those kids who approached Dianne Feinstein?
Yeah, they brought a little kid
Yeah.
out to say to Senator for Life Dianne Feinstein, like, what are you going to do about the climate catastrophe? And it was a good little moment for them. It made them seem anti-establishment, but they are completely part of the Democratic establishment. There'll be a little push and pull, and they'll like try to push Biden to do something to like, re-enter the Paris Climate Accords, which is not like anything to be celebrated. It's a completely phony agreement that not only doesn't go far enough, but contains actually horrible policies like that amount to cap and trade. So I really don't have any hope for anyone actually holding Biden's feet to the fire. I've seen like progressive people who are around Bernie saying Biden has a mandate. And if you allow Biden the perception that there's a mandate, all he's going to do is use it to ratify the center-right suburban strategy that he ran on in order to continue stepping on whatever passes for the left's face in the United States. That's all that's going to happen. So that, I mean, I just see people, maybe they're emotional and they hate Trump so much that they are just feeling like the clouds are lifting, but they're doing themselves in. And the social movements that are behind the Moss Party are not, they're not subservient to its political leadership. In fact, if you look at the initials of the Moss Party, it calls it the political instrument of the people. It's one of the longest acronyms, but in Spanish, it translates to the political instrument. And it basically means that the party is just an instrument of social movements. There's no way we can say that about the Democratic Party. And that's depressing. I think, there'll be maybe more space for people like us to make criticisms of foreign policy.
If Twitter doesn't delete us all first, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say without being called Russian agents, because that kind of insanity it's just going to go back to a simmer from a boil. But at the same time, like, I'm being censored today on Twitter. If you tried to retweet me, It will ask you if you want to read there's more than headlines. Would you like to read the article first? Like Max Blumenthal doesn't accurately synthesize and summarize the article. So you have to go through like a whole procedure to quote tweet me or to retweet me. And then, as I mentioned, we had this documentary we produced on the Senkata massacre. We put it on YouTube, and YouTube proceeded to censor it. There's no bloodshed in it. I mean, we have people talking about their relatives being killed in a very non-graphic way. It's not like Saw 2. There's no being shot.
Which
And
probably is online.
it was
Yeah.
flagged as inappropriate content, and you have to enter your age in order to watch it. And Twitter eliminated the share button on the video. I'm sorry, YouTube eliminated the share button on the video.
Wow.
I suspect like some, Latin American right wingers who, they're very, very afraid of this massacre and its implications in Bolivia, because the interior minister, who I'll talk about in a second, the defense minister, and Janine Áñez face the very real possibility of being put on trial for it. And so I think there was a mass flagging campaign, very similar to the campaign that was waged against the Grayzone on Wikipedia, where we were listed as a deprecated source through a basically coordinated campaign by neoconservatives and Latin American right-wingers who were threatened by our coverage, and total violation of Wikipedia rules. So censorship is going to be an even bigger factor. I mean, I'm glad you brought it up. Like Russiagate, as I said from the beginning, and we all said from the beginning of the Trump administration, and people just ignored me or laughed at me or thought I was crazy or a Russian agent. Russiagate was just kind of a pretext for the management of democracy by a technocratic neoliberal elite that sought to return to power on the heels of a administration like Biden's. And now they've got the White House, they've got the Department of Homeland Security, they've got the FBI, they've got all of those security state mechanisms to impose the most insidious but sweeping censorship regime in the history of the internet.
So I wanted to read this. It may be self-evident what is being said, and there's not maybe a lot of explanation that needs to be added, but I appreciated what Evo Morales had to say on the US election, and Wyatt Reed flagged this. He said, nothing changes even if Biden wins, and quote, a racist fascist right wing loses to a right wing that's perhaps more moderate. And the quote continued, quote, the US people vote but don't govern. Those who govern are transnationals, capitalism, business owners. And basically, as Wyatt pointed out, he was referring to those who overthrew him last year in 2019, those interests. So, I think along these lines, I mean, you've been following the censorship of Donald Trump's speeches in the media, and how they think we're incapable of making decisions for ourselves and sorting through the lies and distortions. Silicon Valley is really taking it upon themselves to shield and protect Biden and Democrats from anything that would come from the GOP, and also, again, like infantilizing us, believing that we can't make our own conclusions. But I also wanted you to speak to, what the aftermath of these elections in Bolivia might be, because you have institutions like the Organization for American States that have escaped any accountability for their role. There's tools of the US government. I imagine Joe Biden enters into the White House, and there's not going to be any effort to look at what the Trump administration was doing with Bolivia and re-examine that policy. It likely will just seek continuity. So I wanted you to speak to the kinds of the neoliberalism from the United States within Bolivia, and what you observed while you were on the ground in Bolivia.
Yeah, I think that just to make a quick comment about the implications of the US election in light of Evo's comments, which are as true as saying that Wednesday occurs in the middle of the week and that the sky is blue. Well, at least it's blue now. Sometimes it's gray in DC, which means that your solar panels won't work. But basically, Trump was going, if he had won, was going to receive the victory that he won in Florida as ratification of the radical strategy, the maximum pressure strategy he applied to Venezuela, Cuba, and was pushing in Latin America. And Trump winning was going to bolster figures who cozied up to him and kind of portrayed themselves as his apprentices, like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. So a Trump victory would have been a great victory for the Latin American right. Biden victory, it's sort of like, how does Netanyahu view the election? He can definitely live with a Biden victory, but he certainly would have preferred Trump because he got his wish list. And there's going to be some tension, but then you have Biden, the figure who said that, if Israel didn't exist, we would have had to have created it. That's kind of how the Latin American right feels about this election too, I think, because Biden, it's not like Biden's going to go down to Venezuela and strike a deal with Nicolas Maduro. And because of fracking, because of shale, and its explosion in the United States, domestic gas and oil production, the United States doesn't really need Venezuela the way it used to. It's able to impose sanctions. And that's another reason. There's a geostrategic reason, along with an economic reason, why Biden and his running mate, Kamala Harris, were so adamant in emphasizing that they were not going to ban fracking. So beyond that, Bolivia's election was very different from ours this time, and I observed it. I was an international election observer, and we did our job. We didn't take it lightly. We thought it was important to see as many polling places as we could. We even, had Wyatt Reed, who was part of our delegation, go to another city to observe polling places. We worked all day. We went to far more polling places than the EU and OAS delegations, which were part of the coup that I can talk about that all day, but they were part of the coup last year. And so we went to 7 polling places. We divided up into teams. And what I saw was pretty impressive. First of all, voting is mandatory in Bolivia. Everyone has to vote. So it's really a national referendum. It's a true national referendum. And we went to pro-Mas areas, and we went to pro-Mesa areas. Carlos Mesa was the main challenger to Mas party candidate Luis Arce. And he is he's a lot like Biden. In fact, this is a little bit of a digression, but he actually enjoyed a fellowship at a think tank in Washington called the Inter-American Dialogue, which is overseen by a Democrat, kind of a liberal guy who supports the Latin American right generally, Michael Shifter. And Mesa is very socially liberal and economically neoliberal. He's a lot like a Democratic Party candidate would be. And so we went to the areas where he was popular, which are like middle class and upper middle class areas around La Paz. And what they do is after voting, there's a box containing all of the paper ballots. They don't have electronic ballots at each voting station. And there'll be like 15 voting stations in a gymnasium. And then each chief at the voting station will take each ballot out, look at it, and declare who was voted for. Comunidad Ciudadana, it was Mesa's party. So you'll hear someone at a pro-Mesa voting station say, Comunidad Ciudadana, over and over again. And then someone behind them is marking each vote on an acta or a tally. And so those tallies are public. So at each voting station, you see how many votes were tabulated for each candidate. And then those are photographed and they go to the party headquarters and the pollsters from across the country. So there's almost no way to commit fraud when you have it that transparent. There were some other mechanisms that were put into place to prevent a narrative from being created, as it was in 2019, that there had been fraud, and that was really positive. I don't want to go into details, but I actually, was planning to see something much more shady than what I saw. And we came out at the end and we said that this process that we observed was free and fair and transparent. So at the end of the day, on election day in Bolivia, we were waiting for the results. And all of the channels, the cable channels, they make Fox News look like Walter Cronkite. They are like firmly in the back pocket of the right. They're run by the oligarchy. The state TV channel was taken over by the coup administration. And they were all promising exit polls on the way soon. No exit polls came. It was 7 o'clock, then 8 o'clock. We were at a hotel downtown where a lot of the other observation delegations were hanging out. It got weird at 9 o'clock. Everyone started to whisper, this is how it's going to go down. This is how they're going to steal it. They're afraid to release the results. And so it's like around 10 o'clock, we went to Moss headquarters. Our delegation gave a press conference declaring that, the exit polls need to be made public. By 11 o'clock, things got even more nervous because where we were outside Moss headquarters, surrounded by media, was also surrounded by the military. And I'll get into that in a second. So we left. I got back to where I was staying by midnight, and it was then that the results were announced, a landslide victory for Moss. I don't know why it wasn't released before. And then you just started to hear fireworks going off in the city, in the working class areas, in the indigenous areas, like the sounds of celebration. And what we felt, and I'll explain why, but what we felt was a sense of relief because we had been threatened in a very real way by the coup administration, in a very real and personal way. And so just a sense of relief washed over us.
That sounds pretty incredible. I wanted to move to a somewhat related topic, which is you briefly mentioned this earlier about the Miami situation, how Joe Biden basically lost Miami, or not lost, I'm sorry, he gained less support in Miami than Hillary Clinton had in 2016. I think she was like 30 points ahead of Donald Trump in Miami in 2016, and Joe Biden had he was about 12 points ahead of Joe Biden this time around. So he lost support among Latinos, specifically in Miami. I mean, I saw a lot of people suggesting that this meant that this led to, or this is like some trend across the country. I don't think that's the case. However, that does lead me, I do want to get your talk on this, since we're kind of going back between Bolivia and the US, is there was the issue of Donald Trump. Sorry, I'm super tired. I can't form sentences very well, so bear with me. I haven't slept very much this week. But what I'm trying to get at is that Donald Trump.
Whenever Biden won, you can sleep and just relax.
Yeah.
We'll go brunch tomorrow.
Yeah, we're gonna go back to brunch. Yeah, I'll see you guys for brunch tomorrow. But what I'm trying to get at is that it's kind of interesting that Donald Trump was able to gain support among people of color. His support among, I mean, it wasn't so significant that they overwhelmingly supported him, but the Democrats under Biden lost some support among Black men, Black women, basically every demographic except for white men, which I thought was really interesting. Whereas Donald Trump gained a little bit of support from Black voters and Latino voters, although I don't know if that's specifically because of Miami or not, as well as Muslims. Like there was a poll done on Muslim support for Trump. There was two polls. One of them had Muslim support for him at 35%, which is significantly more obviously than 4 years ago. Another one had him at 17% among Muslim voters, which is still more than what he got 4 years ago. And what's interesting about that is that 4 years ago, or I guess, yeah, I mean, Donald Trump ran on calling Mexicans rapists and basically accusing all Muslims of being ISIS. So what do you make of that? What do you make of that change in support? Is that significant? What does it mean?
Let me first try to kind of connect that to my personal experience in Bolivia, which I was kind of building up to, and I think it's relevant. When we entered the country, we were followed, I assume, by intelligence agents from the Bolivian coup
Oh my
regime.
God, Max. That feels like it was so long ago, literally only just 3 weeks ago, but time goes so slow right now. I'm just like, I forgot that you were like literally stalked by right wingers on your way to Bolivia. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
they
Sorry,
could have
that's
been
just like,
right-wing activists, but the doxing or whatever you want to call it of me was rolled out through right-wing activists. And we were flying through Santiago, so someone took a picture of me first getting off the flight there from Miami. So they came from Miami. They knew I was on the flight. Then they photographed us, sitting down to eat something in the airport. Me, Wyatt Reed, and I guess Anya wasn't facing the camera, and you saw Ben there, but they were really focusing on me. I think mainly because I have a Wikipedia page, and then they put out those photos and said, Castro Chavista Max Blumenthal is in the country. He's a terrorist. It became this huge national uproar. It was reported in Página 7, which is one of the big newspapers of the right in Bolivia. And the Interior Minister, Arturo Murillo, who is the enforcer of the Áñez regime and was responsible for that massacre in Sencata I mentioned before, he personally threatened us and said, we know who you are, we know where you are, we will throw you in jail or put you on a plane. And that was when we came into Santa Cruz. And Santa Cruz is really like an extension of Miami. It's kind of like the base of the Bolivian right. And I'll talk about it in a second. But right now they are trying to rally another military coup there. And we had planned, instead of just transferring to a plane to La Paz, which is in the more western, more pro-MAS part of the country, to spend a day in Santa Cruz and see this giant rally for the far right candidate, Luis Fernando Camacho, and just to take in the flavor of that without knowing that this was going to be what was confronting us. And, I wouldn't say it was terrifying, but, it was a little nerve-wracking to be wondering if people were going to recognize us and do something to us, or if they were going to find us in our hotel and deport us. But the conspiracy theories about me, I think this is what's relevant to understanding what took place in Miami with Donald Trump doing so well. They just spread like wildfire. People were literally saying in very well trafficking Facebook posts that I am a narco trafficker, that we are here to interfere. Basically, like everything that was said about Russian agents or whatever, RT in 2017 and 16 by demented resistance liberals was being said about us times 10. And this conspiratorial mentality and this hateful, obviously racist mentality and anti-communist fervor is just a part of the ethos of the Latin American right, which has found a nest for itself and a base in Miami for plotting regime change in their former countries. That's pretty much what unites them. And in the past years, the Cuban American right, which we all know of and are very familiar with, has been supplemented by other South American right-wing groups from Colombia, for example, from also Bolivia. They have 100,000 Bolivians in the Miami-Dade in Florida, from Brazil, from Peru, from Venezuela. Venezuela is the most important bloc there now. The ambassador for Juan Guaido, Carlos Vecchio, the fake coup ambassador, basically what he's done since their coup failed is build a gigantic lobbying organization in Miami, the same way that in the 1970s, Jorge Mas Canosa, the sort of mafia don of the Cuban American right, built the Cuban American National Fund, Cuban American National Foundation. And it was very effective in mobilizing votes for Donald Trump. And it was Donald Trump who, in the 2 nights before the election, held an emergency last-minute rally in Miami at the airport, like 14 miles out of town. And there was Roberto Marrero was there. That was Juan Guaido's chief of staff. He's not even an American. He was speaking on behalf of Donald Trump, literally interfering in our elections. Like, can you imagine if a Russian came out to speak for Donald Trump, who was Vladimir Putin's chief of staff, if Dmitry Peskov came and was like, you must go to the polls for Trump, it would never, that it would have been a freak out. But Guaido's people, they're cool. Colombian officials came to Miami and went on right-wing media to plump for Donald Trump, to rustle up votes for Trump. These were like foreign officials from the right-wing Ivan Duque administration, and they were just coming in, and it worked. Basically, the Republican strategy in Florida has been to ride those new diaspora groups to bolster the Cuban bloc and turn Florida into a permanent red state. And I think it was a huge success, and it offset the growth of the Puerto Rican population in Florida, which has come to Florida and, is mostly centered around Orlando because of the neoliberal policies of the Obama administration that destroyed Puerto Rico's economy and like wrecked the lives of all of the youth. It's like all of these educated youth are like now trying to work jobs at Disneyland. That's their future. So basically, the conspiratorial, anti-communist, hateful mentality, coupled with the fact that Donald Trump did exactly what the Latin American right wanted in Venezuela. They denormalized with Cuba. That, I think, flipped Florida for him and was a huge factor. And of course, you got Joe Scarborough and all of these never Trump elements saying, well, they lost, the Democrats lost because they were too socialist. Like, yeah, Joe Biden was just too much of a socialist. It really did. It was a factor in why Joe Biden was running around attacking Bernie and saying he's not a socialist. And it was a factor in the Democratic primary. Remember when the last debate between Biden and Bernie, where Bernie just voluntarily rolled over and died for someone who was like already like in early stage dementia, they had Univision anchor asking questions, and her question to Bernie is, how are you going to win Florida when you're saying you're a socialist? And Bernie's like, I am absolutely not a social. I am a socialist, but I hate authoritarianism. I'm against all authoritarians. And Biden just kept hammering him for it. So it was a factor there too. And basically what the Democrats have to do is give people something in Florida who aren't part of that little block, but they don't offer anything. And that goes to the other part of your question. I mean, that might have been like a long way to it. Why did Trump increase his share of votes among Black and brown people? Well, I mean, a lot of the Latinos in Miami are white. But
right. That's actually really frustrated me because people didn't understand that. Like they were suggesting that Trump had a bunch of like Mexicans supporting him or something when it was just like a bunch of white people from Latin America who are just like other people.
But the percentage was low. It was like 5%, but a higher total of Black vote for Trump. There are a lot of reasons for that. One is that the Democrats have never done anything for Black people. They never produce any material change for them. Another is like smart people critical-minded people can see the fact that Joe Biden was the author of the crime bill that helped decimate Black America. I mean, it dealt one of the biggest blows to Black America since the Jim Crow era. It brought back, he was the author of the new Jim Crow. And Trump emphasized that in the second debate where he trounced Biden, contrary to like what all of these like left pundits who refused to be objective said. Trump, as I mentioned before, he catered to like micro trends that cut across racial and class lines. Like, he was willing to do press conferences with Lil Wayne or Lil Pump or people that like Joe Biden would have considered deplorable and Kamala Harris wouldn't have wanted to be around. But people who have real cachet. In the end, like all the Democrats could do was like bring out like the mid 2000s with Eminem doing this like pathetic 8 Mile soundtrack. And the power of Pentecostal Christianity is underestimated. And it also goes back to Latin America. Pentecostal Christianity is really like a soft power weapon that has been used by the United States for decades since the Rockefeller brothers helped fund the birth of these Pentecostal Assemblies of God churches in Brazil to help them gain access to the Amazon and exploit it. And Pentecostal Christianity is extremely popular in Africa, and it is extremely popular in Black communities in the US, as well as white communities. So everybody was laughing about Trump's spiritual advisor, Paula White, this complete huckster, speaking in tongues. It's known as glossolalia in Pentecostal, charismatic Pentecostal Christianity when they speak in tongues, and they're conveying the secret language of God. Oh, Rabasaka Shandalala baby. Oh, Tandalada Jesus. Oh, they like saying the names of the Jackson family. Oh, Janet Michael Latoya, you know, and it's like, it sounds so funny, but that's like how they get into it. And if you look at those crowds, it's a very multiracial crowd that's sitting there as she's like, victory, victory, victory for Trump, victory for Trump. And there are many Black people in that audience who are just like, yes, victory for Trump. And that's just what they're into. They're into that. They're into the prosperity gospel. Prosperity gospel was a huge weapon aimed at destroying the civil rights spirit of the Black community in America. They're replacing all of the traditional Baptist preachers who believe that God is the God of justice, who use that kind of prophetic voice that you still hear from figures like Cornel West, with people like Creflo Dollar and his wife, what's her name, Taffy? Creflo Dollar, he speaks to like stadiums in Madison Square Garden filled with mostly Black people. And he tells them that, if you give me your money, you're planting a seed in heaven that will multiply, multiply, multiply. You will prosper. And, that's real. That's just a reality that I think benefited Trump. And if you see all those photos of Trump with people laying their hands on him, again, it's multiracial pastors. There's some Black pastors there, and they're laying hands on Donald Trump while everyone else is like, he's a racist. And so I thought it was only natural that him being willing to cater to that crowd in such a naked way, more than even George W. Bush was, he was going to increase his share of vote by a small but possibly pivotal amount.
So before we would conclude, I just have a couple things to raise, and if you have any reaction. First, I noticed that the New York Times actually was on this issue of disinformation that you were describing as it occurred in the Miami area, but I would suspect that they were only doing it because they failed to find anything that they could tie to Russia or Iran. And in fact, the framing of their article is actually that they went looking and they found nothing, but they found Spanish disinformation, as they term it. And so I'd like you to speak to the capture of our institutions that simply is just going to be ignoring this kind of disinformation that spreads these conspiracy theories, the kind of work that the Grayzone does, following the right-wing factions that really do pump out this material and do affect our ability to engage democratically because everyone is being brainwashed. And the fact that all these people in and around the Biden orbit have been involved in these factions and these institutions that have been pushing things like the Russiagate narrative for the past 4 years. And those are likely the people who are going to staff a Biden administration and have those links back to the Silicon Valley companies that are going to be, as the right wing would term it, it's the only way that I have to speak of it very simply, this nanny state impulse to basically be moderating our ability and access to access information on the off chance that we come in contact with something toxic, and it would provide them with some trouble with actually being able to govern, and they simply don't want that. So that's one thing that I'd like you to speak to. And then if you're able to take some time, we didn't get a chance to talk to you since you put out the thing about the green billionaires that were involved with this activist network of pushing the Planet of the Humans. And I wanted to make sure I raised this on this broadcast because Rania and we actually had Josh Fox on our show. And in a way, I ended up getting duped into providing a platform for Josh Fox to do the very thing that you expose with this Grayzone report that was really crucial. And I had seen this documentary, and I had appreciated the network that was exposed, this green billionaire network that, again, we're going to probably see staffing the Biden administration with Al Gore and John Kerry and all of these people who have access to these hedge funds that are making billions off of so-called sustainable investing. They're going to have positions in the Biden administration. But yeah, we gave a platform to Josh Fox to push the censorship of Michael Moore's film. And I ended up removing it from the YouTube channel in which we distribute our show because it just seemed unconscionable. But at the time, when I talked to Rania hadn't seen the film, and
that's not even what we had him on for. We had him on to talk about something else, and he had just that day launched his email campaign to get people to get people to sign a petition to censor.
But to conclude, I was just saying that he used our show. I mean, he very deliberately was ready. He knew we were going to be offering him a platform, and in that night he had sent out his petition, which you detail, and he came and he used our show. So I don't know if you have anything to say to the first thing. The second thing's probably more interesting, but those are the things that I wanted you to ask before we wrapped up the show, or answer.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it quick because the piece I did on Planet of the Humans was like 10,000 words. I mean, we could do a whole separate show about it. But just on Josh Fox, he reached out to you to come on your show, I assume?
I don't know. So before he had gotten into this, we were pretty friendly with him, and I trusted him as a speaker. And then, he really outed himself with this Planet of the Humans episode as somebody who is just, I guess we'll say useful idiot, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I think that it was positive that you hosted him, but a lot of people in our kind of ecosystem, our political, intellectual ecosystem, they don't understand environmental politics very well. And I used the opportunity of having the whole world or the country slow down because of the first few months of the lockdown and pandemic to try to understand it better, because I knew something wasn't right. And I knew something wasn't right when this censorship campaign emerged. And what I can say just in brief is that I came to see the censorship campaign as the same kind of as an industry censorship campaign, like what the oil and gas industry would do to a film that threatened it. Maybe like Josh Fox's first major successful film, Gasland, probably I think is his only successful film, on the fracking industry. Or what the Syrian regime change crowd did, including the founder of the White Helmets, James Lemercier, did when my book, The Management of Savagery, came out on a fairly well-established label, Verso, in order to try to sabotage my book tour. Basically, Josh Fox was not some independent actor. And this is what Planet of the Humans shows, that him and a lot of the other censors who were behind the suppression campaign, Bill McKibben, while they present themselves as these green warriors, are de facto lobbyists for a renewables industry that represents a $40 trillion profit center for hedge funders and people who are, financiers and oligarchs like Mike Bloomberg or Al Gore, who runs a hedge fund that's specifically aimed at cashing in on this industry. Josh Fox's latest production, which was, it wasn't canceled, but most of it was canceled at a theater in New York, allegedly because of his bad behavior, which he blamed on anti-Semitism. I didn't know he was Jewish. It was executive produced by someone named Tom Dinwiddie. Tom Dinwiddie is a renewables industry tycoon who has over 40 patents on solar technology and profits off of all these government subsidies that are going to go into the solar industry in a Biden administration. The solar industry, I should mention, that has been not doing so well since the Obama administration, and which faces serious challenges, and which is, producing a technology that is not necessarily good for the environment. I don't want to get into all that, but basically Josh Fox is being supported by a solar tycoon who is a major funder of all of these what he calls do tanks, but are actually think tanks where they work on these collaborations between the 4 major banks and the green lobby to push green tech. So we need to stop seeing the Green New Deal in these rosy terms and start asking serious questions about what form it will take and who's pushing it and whether they're just activists or PR operatives. Similarly, Naomi Klein, she wanted to censor this film. She approached Michael Moore before it was even out and asked him to retract it, to take his name off it. She denounced it. She signed Josh Fox's letter. Well, the very same foundations which are funding Bill McKibben's organization are funding her. She's been she's on Bill McKibben's board. They are lobbying for this entire project that will benefit Wall Street in a different way. And I think all the things she said about growth, just endless consumption and growth being the problem, which were conveyed in this film in a way that I think very few documentaries have conveyed. All the things she said were just taken off the table in order for her to protect her institutional allegiances and her career. And that was pathetic. I mean, these are the people who should know better. It was absolutely pathetic and revealing. I think the most revealing thing is when Biden, after receiving this endorsement from the Sunrise Foundation, from the Sunrise Movement, the day he announced his environmental plan, weeks after, he flagrantly declares that he supports fracking. And then Kamala Harris goes out of her way in the VP debate to declare that she supports fracking. And Josh Fox says, well, this is actually a good thing somehow. And I still support them. And we need to vote for Biden. All he was doing was punching left the whole campaign and attacking anyone who is suspicious of Biden. And it just shows what a complete unprincipled opportunist he is. And then Naomi Klein responds, well, we're just going to make him do it. We're going to make him ban fracking. And I still support Biden. I mean, give me a fucking break. You're not going to make Biden do it. You're not going to make him give up domestic oil production, because what protests have you been a part of anyway? And so I thought that was absurd. And then, for Naomi Klein to attack Glenn Greenwald because he leaves The Intercept and starts a Substack, and to mock him for starting a Substack when she has an endowed fellowship, and during a time of like economic collapse and pandemic, she has an endowed fellowship that has been supported by the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Brothers and corporate America and the Harvey Weinstein Fund. And it's the Gloria Steinem Gender Studies Endowed Fellowship at Rutgers University. Yes, Harvey Weinstein gave Gloria Steinem a bunch of money to create an endowment for Naomi Klein. And she's attacking people, independent journalists who use Substack. So these people just completely exposed themselves even after my article came out. And I think we just need to ask questions about the agenda they're pushing and whether it will actually be the environmental panacea they say it will be. Then there's the disinformation question you asked. I said I was going to be brief, but I got kind of worked up.
Well, what if I just put it simply? I mean, what do you think people should have at the top of their mind as Biden staffing his administration? And there's going to be these individuals like Jake Sullivan and others who have been tied to these operations.
Jake Sullivan was Hillary Clinton's top foreign policy advisor, responsible for her positions which are wrongly described as hawkish, which are actually just straight up militaristic. And he knows nothing about the world. He's just sort of this, like, basically a unalloyed blob creature. Actually, he denounced me. He issued a formal condemnation of me during the 2016 campaign on behalf of the Hillary campaign, because I criticized Elie Wiesel for cozying up to right-wingers and taking all this money from Sheldon Adelson and Pastor John Hagee. So like the Hillary campaign denounced me and the Trump campaign denounced me. It was like the most interesting campaign of my life. And that was partly thanks to Jake Sullivan. But there'll be all of these characters surrounding Biden. And, I think it's unfair to say that a Biden foreign policy and a Trump foreign policy would be exactly the same. But what Biden's going to try to do is repair our alliances in order to head off the trajectory we were moving towards in the world, towards a multipolar world, beefing up NATO, beefing up the EU, helping Japan remilitarize, undercutting Moon in South Korea and creating this bulwark against China. Those kinds of things, the pivot to Asia, we're going to see those in a Biden administration. And then, an Iran deal will be designed to contain Iran. So it will be different than Trump. And there's this sense among that group of people that they've lost a large part of the United States population. They look at them with contempt. They see them as, conspiratorial QAnon idiots, or or white racists or whatever. And maybe there's some truth to that, but they know that there's a complete lack of consensus for the agenda that they're pushing and the technocracy that they represent. And that will necessitate more of what you call this nanny state censorship, where they think they know better than everyone, where everyone has to be treated as little children. And we saw a nice preview of it with the president of the United States' speeches being cut off for fact checks by the anchors. And the fact checks on CNN amounted to basically Jake Tapper having a meltdown about how, Trump is attacking our democratic institutions, as if CNN cares about our democratic institutions, when they celebrated the spies who wiretapped the president, who sent confidential secret police operatives into the Trump campaign, like Stefan Halper, to entrap its staff, and then ran this phony intelligence operation that we know of as Russiagate for 4 years. And then they hired those very spies to be contributors on their networks. And they are claiming that they care about democratic institutions. It's ridiculous. So we're moving into a phase of, I think many other countries are already there, of managed democracy, where a technocratic elite represented by officially a Democratic Party will try to not just manufacture consent, but manage people's ability to access information in order to suppress skepticism about an agenda that people already largely reject. It's not going to work. I don't know where it's going to go to, but what I would say is that those of us who are in alternative media, whether within reason, I'm not going to go collaborate with someone who's pushing like xenophobia and white supremacist propaganda, but within reason, we need to collaborate across political lines in order to organize a movement to create a countervailing form of pressure against Silicon Valley, because we do generate a lot of traffic for them. We do, whether we like it or not, generate a lot of revenue for them. And, we should be able to take it away and move elsewhere, or at least put them on blast for what they're doing. And right now there's no movement. So that's what I think is imperative to get ready for the Biden era.
Well,
that was very well said. I just want to go to brunch. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah.
I
When are we getting
zoned
omelets?
After Biden got a lead in
Oh my God.
Pennsylvania, I put my wine.
I just want to sing Georgia over mimosas and bacon.
Yeah. I love Georgia. I think we should just kill everybody in red states. I kind of feel like that's the mentality of liberal elites, is they want to just like kill off Trump voters. Like, and when I say, I just mean like they don't want to even like understand that there's almost 70 million people came out to vote for this guy. And you don't want to understand why. Like, there's a lot of different reasons why, but like, how do you expect ever? And said they want to just manage information and they think that'll work. But I feel like that'll just end up increasing
those voters. Like, I'm not allowed to say that the voters should be like torpedoed, because like then we'll get banned from Twitter, like Steve Bannon, while fucking Marco Rubio's Twitter account is still up after he called for the murder of and like beheading and like sodomization by bayonet of Nicolas Maduro. That was cool. But yeah, I'm not going to call for the Trump voters to be torpedoed, but like, I don't want anyone to be torpedoed. I'm against torpedoes. I'm anti-torpedo. It's a completely Nazi invention fired by U-boats. So I'm against it. So don't ban my Twitter account. But the voters, man, like those Trump voters, like those aren't like the white working class or whatever. Like those people are some of the most toxic assholes of our society. And
They're a product of our society, but they're a product of our society. Like,
they're part of it. They're a big part of it.
They're a big part of it. Trump is kind of like a representation, in my opinion, of like America's worst elements in a person. Like, if like America was a person.
I gotta say, I was building up to something.
Sorry.
But yes, he represents all of that. Yes, it's totally true. And like, you know, there's just so many suburban assholes who like Trump because he reminds them of a quality in themselves that they want to put on display. And when I was in Miami, there were trucks just driving by randomly. I'd just be sitting on a corner and some truck with some big vociferous white dude in it, and he'd just be like, rah, rah, and I didn't even know what he was yelling, but it was like just yelling. It was like, this is the day ahead of the election when white guys get to drive around with big Trump flags and scream at people on the street who don't even know what they're saying. And there would be like little children there, and I don't know. That's real, but there also is a real justifiable hatred for the neoliberal technocracy and those like the wine moms and the neocons and just the repulsive people who think that they are entitled to be in power. The people who embraced Bill Kristol, all of those people. I mean, we need, like, I would love to see a reverse Mariella boat lift and just to send them all off to a distant atoll in the Pacific consisting of like discarded plastic bags where like Bill Kristol and Pierre Omidyar and Neera Tanden and Anna Navarro and the entire Lincoln Project can just like fight over seagull carcasses to survive with no Wi-Fi connection or phone data at all. Like, we need that in this country. And I think then we could start kind of coming together, I think, you know, and send the Trump voters with them. But basically, the problem right now is that if there were a candidate who was better than Bernie, maybe more relatable, but was pushing real pro-working class policies, de-emphasizing all of the silly identity politics stuff. I mean, you can't like completely rule out identity, but like when Elizabeth Warren said that I will have a trans child select my education secretary, like that kind of stuff. It wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter at this point because those working people, the people out there that are just pissed off and wanted to just give the finger to the neoliberal technocracy will no longer believe that the Democrats can ever run someone who represents just the broader needs of a working class. Like, even if they really had someone who sincerely promised healthcare, free college, I don't know if anyone would believe them at this point, coming from the Democratic Party, because of what the party is and has been for so long. And that's just a problem that's going to be with us. I really think that the possibility of voting in socialism in the U.S. is over, as it is in the UK. We saw what happened to Jeremy Corbyn. We saw what happened to Bernie Sanders. I don't think it's going to happen for the rest of my life. And the people who say they're socialists in Congress are basically just Democrats. I don't see hope for that. And also Bernie would not have won. Stop saying that. He wouldn't have won. They would have done
I actually think he would have been crushed. I think he would have been crushed.
The Democrats would have done what they did with Corbyn. The Democrats would have been like, crush him. Yes, do it. All the institutions that were against Trump would have turned on him, because at least Trump represents the interests of the ruling class. Right,
and I think that plays into something else about the issue of these policies. Everybody keeps saying Medicare for all is super popular, minimum wage hikes are super popular, and that's true. They are popular among a majority of the population. But people also forget that we have all these corporate consultants and like very wealthy interests that will take something that's really popular and they have the ability to market it as something evil. And I think we saw that or something really evil marketed as something popular that you should support. Like, and even among educated people, they're easily propagandized. Look what happened in California, the supposedly most liberal or most progressive state in the country, and Uber was able to spend like $160 million to convince people they should support Uber not having to give benefits to its drivers. And that passed like overwhelmingly because, and then, on the other hand, like, it's because you have these corporate consultants that Max, you mentioned. I saw your tweet about, there was like an LA Times article noting the role of Kamala Harris's family in pushing that proposition in California. You could talk more about that if you want, but there are these corporate consultants that for my entire life since I can remember have been able to take these really popular policies and convince people that they're bad. So I think that that's also something that's a huge obstruction for any socialist policies in this country, because corporations run this country. They have all the power, they have all the money, they have all the expertise in the world to convince voters to vote against their interests. And I think that there's a bit of an overconfidence among whatever the left means. When I say the left, I guess I mean like the DSA. I think there's a bit of an overconfidence about how easy it is to actually, the acceptable left. I think there's an overconfidence about how easy it is to just vote in socialism if these policies are popular. It doesn't work like that in this country.
Yeah, people were like, those Fox News polls show that most Americans want free healthcare, but when the rubber hits the road, it's another story. And the Republicans, the anyone who's against that has way more money on their side, and they can frame it as socialized healthcare that will take away your freedom, peel off enough people. Prop 22 is a perfect example of just what a sellout culture we have. And, I see it in our media. I've watched just almost all of my contemporaries, not all of them, but almost all of them, move to the center in the last decade, chasing opportunities, being co-opted and neutralized and foundationized and given grants, and then intimidated against saying what they would have said 10 years ago about something like Syria. The Intercept is just a perfect example of that, of just like journalists getting hundreds of thousands of dollars to basically do nothing, and incentivized to not cross any red lines of what it takes to be on the acceptable left. And they're just worthless. They're completely worthless. I have no respect for them. Like, I've seen so many people I was around The Nation and elsewhere just basically become like boring Democrats or do nothing. They say nothing anymore. And it's just a small, that's the culture we're in. We see it up close. But, it's the same in a capitalist society in so many other spheres, including in politics. So, I talked about Kamala Harris's family being involved in leading the fight for Prop 22 in California, which would allow companies like Uber and Lyft to classify their actual employees as independent contractors and thereby deny them benefits like sick leave and prevent them from unionizing. Her brother-in-law, Tony West, led the campaign. Her niece, Mina Harris, is the diversity officer of Uber. Her former campaign chief when she was running for Senate is on Uber's board. But then there's also union people from SEIU, which is the Service Workers Union. It's one of the most important, maybe the most important union in California. LaFonza Butler, she is consulting for Uber now. Andy Stern, he was the head of SEIU. That guy is pushing education privatization to destroy teachers' unions. All these sellouts just chase opportunities, and there aren't any opportunities for people like us. Rania, remember when you were like run out of like respectable media? I mean, where were the opportunities then? You were destroyed for like telling the truth on Syria. And I mean, where else? If you had not taken a job at In the Now, which is like the subject of like the FBI investigating and like Senate intelligence. If you had not done that, I don't know how you would be in media and have a life.
I don't know how I don't know how I would be able to like afford a roof over my head. And that's at the end of the day, that's why this works, because we live in a capitalist system where people need to make a salary. And when they have hundreds of thousands of dollars dangled in front of their face, like they're gonna jump at that, and they're gonna change the way that they speak publicly. But by the way, real quick about the Uber thing, you were mentioning SEIU, the California NAACP also got on board with the Uber, which is
and
really
this is
disgusting.
another reason why Trump increases his share of votes among Black people and minorities, is because the Black liberal class has been completely bought off by corporate America. They're just delivering nothing. And so what alternative are they presenting? I mean, look at what James Clyburn is, thanks to James Clyburn, who's like a tool of the pharmaceutical industry in South Carolina, that Biden was the nominee at all, because he just shepherded a bunch of people to the polls for Biden, and that was the end of Bernie. So it's a very hopeless situation in the US, and I'm not here to offer any hope. I think like we need to provide an alternative instead of looking for hope within pre-existing institutions. And I think one of the worst things about the Trump era is not that the institutions stood up and resisted him, it's that the institutions will outlast him, because our institutions in this country, whether it's the Fourth Estate, the media, or the Senate or the Supreme Court, they exist, or the labor unions, who just negotiate with management and don't do wildcat strikes. They exist to prevent democracy. They're not here to like shore up democracy. They are preventing the participatory democracy that was, supposed to be what we were fighting for. So it's important to create alternatives, and at least an alternative vision. That's why, we've spent so much time in other places like Bolivia, to broaden our horizons and to make connections with people who have another vision, who've actually succeeded in their own countries. It also helps, when you connect with people in your own field who are journalists in those countries, to just not feel insane, because it's really hard for me to relate to a lot of other people in what used to be known as progressive media in the United States.
Well, I think there's very few people who still have any credibility, and whoever they are, we're going to need to work together under a Biden administration. And I don't know what kind of litmus test I want to apply, but, to the extent that there are...
Well, I consider you one of the few credible gumshoe reporters, and apparently your reporting was too good on Assange for The Intercept to use.
Well, yes. I do think, though, that there are some aspects of that organization that are terribly dysfunctional, and also because they were forming a organization that was built around personalities and their followings. It was sort of like a rock supergroup, I would equate it to. They ran into some terrible issues. And so I'm not convinced that actually Glenn Greenwald passed my message back to the editorial board so that I could get an opportunity to do work for them. But at the same time, the most fundamental and important thing about what happened with The Intercept and Assange is that they did not invest in reporting at all on the extradition trial. So no matter the dysfunction, they did absolutely nothing to provide reporting on Assange. And I think Glenn Greenwald can be held responsible to some degree, but almost entirely I put the blame on Betsy Reed, editor-in-chief, for making the decision not to invest in coverage of Assange.
Maybe she didn't have the money.
No, she didn't want to give up her $500,000 a year budget that she has for herself to pay anybody. But Rodney, you should, before we close, as we close out here,
I would buy a boat. I'd become a boater if I had that money.
I don't know, man. I don't want to be on the
for Bernie.
Voters.
You need to hire your own global organization to provide security for you. You'd have the money to do that. You could bring on your own. But Rania, you should just because we raised it on the last week, if you don't mind, Max, I want to have Rania mention what you were saying about what happened with you and the Intercept with your reporting. Because
well, what I was saying was that, I actually managed to write a few articles for the Intercept because of Glenn. Glenn like sort of pushed me on the editors and kept insisting and insisting. And so I did a little bit of reporting for them back in 2016 on both the elections, on the Hillary Clinton campaign, as well as I got to write one article about Syria. There was this leaked UN report that came my way that was commissioned to investigate the impact of US and EU sanctions on Syria. And the report determined that they were some of the most harsh sanctions ever imposed in history. And so I got that report in my hand. What?
So the U.S. You've been so discredited. Like the U.S. is just funneling money there, and like things are going great, and nobody's starving.
Nobody's starving. So I wrote this article about this report. It was pretty straightforward. I even, interviewed a few of the experts. So I quoted think tank experts, which is what you're supposed to do if you're a real acceptable journalist. You have to quote think tank experts. That especially if you're Intercept, I guess. So anyway, so I did everything I was supposed to do, and then this article was just like attacked by the whole regime change machine that Max mentioned earlier. That came after him over the white helmet stuff. And they had to issue like 2 or 3 really absurd, unnecessary corrections. There was nothing that needed to be corrected. It kind of reminded me of the way reporting on Palestine used to get treated, right? Like how people, all these news organizations would issue like 5 corrections every time the Israel lobby would get angry that they mentioned this many Palestinians were killed. So after that, I never wrote for the Intercept again. I pitched them a lot of articles. I mean, it may also have had to do with the whole smear campaign against me for going to Syria, but regardless, like I had on the ground reports that, were really good and all this stuff I could have reported for them. And they just repeatedly said, I was repeatedly told no. But what I had noted when I tweeted about this was that every single time I got like a rejection from them, it was always, oh, Glenn passed along your proposal, but so I was just noting, like, Glenn did try. I don't know how hard he tried, but he did try to do what he said he wanted to do at the Intercept, which is bring in, freelance, independent, adversarial journalists. And it seems like the people, on top, the editors are the ones who wouldn't allow that to happen, because that's who would reject what should have been the kind of report you would have seen there had it been the kind of outlet it said it wanted to be. But ultimately, I ended up writing a lot of those articles for the Grayzone, which actually fills like the void of what the Intercept claimed it was going to be 6 years ago or 7 years ago when it started.
Yeah, which we knew it wasn't going to be that. But I mean, didn't Betsy say, "Oh, we're going to have a round table of just Syrians discussing Syria," and that never even happened. Instead, when she rejected one of your pitches.
Oh yeah, she was like, "Oh, we already have people working on the same stuff." Like thanks, but we already have someone working on something similar, and it never happened. So, and also like to be clear, the Intercept Syria coverage after that was disgusting. It was all like a whitewash of death squads the U.S. was funding in Syria.
It's worse than that. It was an AstroTurf campaign. Murtaza, who is like their little in-house regime change stooge, he did a profile of the White Helmets that was furnished to him by the Syria campaign, which was the billionaire-backed public relations arm of the White Helmets. He was basically participating in an influence operation. And he wrote the same article that appeared in Time magazine, which I later exposed because the White Helmets tried to recruit Roger Waters. And I got the emails they sent to him, and they were like, here's an article in Time magazine, and here's an article from the Intercept. And it was the Syria campaign trying to recruit him. So they were running an influence operation that ran through the Intercept with like this like talentless, mediocre character who is desperate for like approval and to be relevant, pushing it. And, they were constantly using sources like the Syrian Network for Human Rights, which was run out of Qatar and just fabricate statistics. And then the worst thing that happened was that the Intercept began funding Bellingcat. They had Bellingcat come in and give these training sessions for like $2,500 a head. Nobody learns anything. I mean, have you seen anyone at the Intercept use Bellingcat techniques? No. And it's just a backdoor way of paying Bellingcat. Elliot Higgins boasted on Twitter that we get more from the Intercept than we get from the British government. And that really shows what a corrupt operation the Intercept is, what a completely irredeemable, corrupt operation, pro-war operation the Intercept is, when you see Robert Hackey actually citing Bellingcat in order to justify U.S. and British airstrikes on Syria for a chemical attack in Douma that, as we now know from 4 OPCW whistleblowers, never took place, which was obviously a staged operation. But, you know, they're citing Bellingcat, they're paying Bellingcat, and now what is Bellingcat doing? What is Bellingcat doing? They're attacking whistleblowers from the OPCW. They are working with the OPCW, obviously, with fake documents, as we reported, not they reported at the Grayzone, to smear whistleblowers. So here's what's happening. The Intercept is paying an organization that smears whistleblowers. Wasn't the Intercept started to promote and defend whistleblowers?
Yeah. No, I mean, the brand I understood as it was founded was that they were going to, you know, be really interested in leaking and defending leakers, and they were going to promote whistleblowers. It looks like Max is frozen here, at least for me.
He's making kind of like a Tucker Carlson face.
If he had a bow tie, he's missing the bow tie, but it would be really good. I don't know if that's his. Is that his connection?
It must be if me and you are still talking and seeing each other.
You know, and I actually don't know if he'll be able to get back in. But
okay,
there he is.
Your face froze for a second, and then we lost you, but you're back.
But in any case, I think this conversation has probably run its course.
Yeah, sorry.
Would we like to? Here, I'll just put up the website. Yeah, we'll have plenty of brunches during Biden's administration.
Starting tomorrow, I'm going to brunch every day for the next 4 years.
Well, I'm just going to be flagging content left and right. You know, I'm going to start working for Twitter as just one of their detectives that can go flag anything anti-Biden, right? So that I can. I just assume all journalists are going to sell out and just become hall monitors for social media while they are. And Max is frozen.
That's not true. Oh, I wish Max was here to hear that. Okay, I actually don't think they'll all become hall monitors for Joe Biden. I think that another segment of journalists will also continue the Bernie grift. I think that Bernie, I mean, I was a Bernie supporter, but I think his campaign at this point has led to a sort of grift where there's people that literally just produce content about how Bernie would have won, and that's like literally their whole career now. Which, I mean, at least it's not destructive. I actually don't think it's not like destructive like selling war, but it's quite lucrative to just continually write articles and produce videos that say Bernie would have won. I should start doing that.
Max's connection is like being throttled by some secret spy agency or something. So if you can get in a plug, Max, is there anything you wanted to tell people about before we wrap up the show?
Follow my Twitter account while it's still there.
All right.
And you got a few more days. TheGrayzone.com, before the government seizes it, as they seized American Herald Tribune. The Department of Justice literally just seized an alternative website the other day. Just like, well, can't happen to me. It only happens to people like Alex Jones. So, yeah. Get it while you can. We're still here.
It's a dark episode. This is a dark episode.
It's a dark ending where our sites are about to be seized. Go to shadowproof.com, go to grayzone.com, because they'll be disappearing when Joe Biden is president. All right. So thank you everyone for watching the show.
If I do this, it's going to be called like a Red Brown Alliance secret symbol. So I was gonna like give you a thumbs up, and I'm like, they're gonna call it that.
Let's all do it. Let's all just like.
If three people do it.
Alexander Reed Ross will like write another article for the SPLC. He'll be like,
All right, everyone. So I'll just do a quick plug for our show while we have our thumbs up here to end. If you go to patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure and become a supporter of the show, you can help us keep going. 7 years, and hopefully we won't get seized by the Biden administration. So, although I hear Patreon's going to start deleting accounts if you
Is this the alt-right symbol?
Right. Yeah. All right, everyone.
All right,
we'll be back
bye.
next week with another episode.